Before we begin, if you enjoy slow, immersive history that helps you unwind, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making these long videos for you. And if you're listening right now, what time is it where you are? Let us know in the comments. We read every one. Now, settle in. Let's begin. Asterisk, the winds of the desert, slow and indifferent, have long swept over the stone ruins of Deir el-Bahari. They brush against the columns, the lintels, the walls that still stand sun-bleached, and silent, bearing the marks of a woman who refused to be a footnote in her own civilization. She was not supposed to rule. Born into the royal household during the 18th dynasty of ancient Egypt, Hatshepsut was the daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I and Queen Emos. Her father, a military man turned king, built the empire with spear and quarry. Her mother, less discussed, perhaps whispered advice behind veils of linen and gold. Hatshepsut married her half-brother, Thutmose II, a common royal practice. She was queen, but not yet queenly in the way the world would remember her. Not yet a ruler. Not yet a name scrubbed from stone. When Thutmose II died, a small child named Thutmose III technically took the throne. But a child cannot reign over an empire soaked in heat, war, and grain. Someone had to rule in his place. Hatshepsut stepped forward. At first, she served as regent or guardian of sorts. But regents don't wear false beards. They don't refer to themselves as His Majesty. Hatshepsut did. Over time, she stopped waiting for her nephew to grow up. She became pharaoh. She did not become a queen in power. She became a king in every way that mattered to the state. Her images, carved meticulously into stone, show a masculine figure, broad shoulders, traditional kilt, the ceremonial beard of pharaohs, and inscriptions. She is referred to with male pronouns and royal epithets meant for kings. But make no mistake, Hatshepsut was a woman. She just refused to let the limits of gender define the limits of her authority. To understand the quiet boldness of this act, one must understand the bones of ancient Egyptian power. It was deeply religious, ritualistic, cosmic in its balance. Pharaohs were not mere kings. They were divine mediators between the gods and the people. And for thousands of years, that role was envisioned as male. For Hatshepsut to declare herself pharaoh was not only a political maneuver, it was a theological recalibration. And so, she built temples, obelisks, and colossal shrines rose under her command. She restored trade routes that had gone dormant since the Middle Kingdom. The most famous expedition was to the land of Punta, place of gold, ebony, and incense. Reliefs from her mortuary temple depict the journey. Ships filled with riches, trees brought back in pots, and the people of Punt with strange, bulbous heads and exotic wares. Egypt's coffers swelled not with plunder, but with diplomacy. Hatshepsut was not a conqueror. She was a negotiator, a builder, a stabilizer. Yet, even as she ruled effectively and with near-unquestioned authority, there remained the quiet balancing act of her identity. The inscriptions, said he, but the statues wore her features. The temples were his. But the architecture whispered her name. This duality, this historical tension, became one of the most fascinating footnotes in royal propaganda. Her image was a blend of masculine symbols and feminine details. Her rule, a negotiation between divine mandate and human fragility. And when her reign ended quietly, after 22 years, her name began to vanish. Literally, Thutmose III, now grown and ruler in his own right, began a methodical campaign of erasure. Her cartouches were chiseled off walls. Her images were replaced with generic kings. Statues of her were shattered, buried, hidden in storage rooms and beneath sand. Why? Historians have debated this for centuries. Some suggest political insecurity, that Thutmose III wanted to assert his own legacy without the shadow of a powerful ant lingering in stone. Others say the priesthood disapproved of a female pharaoh, and sought to correct a cosmic imbalance. Still others think it was practical a desire to present a clean line of succession from Thutmose I to Thutmose III, uninterrupted by a female anomaly. But her erasure was not immediate. It came decades after her death, suggesting a deliberate, strategic decision, not vengeance, but rewriting, as if her story was never meant to remain intact, as if she was never meant to be remembered in full. Yet she was too monumental to disappear entirely. Fragments of her story survived in inscriptions too remote to erase, in tombs too hidden to desecrate, and in architecture too grand to crumble. Today, you can walk the sandstone colonnades of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari and see scenes of her coronation, her divine birth, and her expeditions. You can stand beneath obelisks she ordered raised, feel the strange silence of a ruler who was both everywhere and nowhere in the historical record. You can feel quiet, the weight of someone who shaped an empire was quietly edited out of it, and the question that lingers like desert wind against stone. How does a woman rule as a man without ever being allowed to be fully either? The desert does not forget, even when men try to make it forget. Centuries before modern archaeology, long before foreign expeditions chipped at the edges of Egyptian ruins, the story of Hatshepsut lay beneath layers of silence, quite literally. Her name had been chiseled off walls, her statues shattered and dumped into burial pits. But the stone, dry and patient, held memory in its scars. What remained of her legacy survived because it had once been vast. She had built more than most pharaohs before her. Even the act of erasure was monumental in efforts, so much so that some records simply escaped the chisel. But before the silence, there was speech, and the walls once spoke loudly in her voice. The inscriptions at Deir el-Bahari were deliberate in tone, mythological in structure. They told of a divine conception that Hatshepsut was born not from man, but from the god Amen himself. The carvings showed Amen visiting her mother in the guise of Thutmose I, whispering fate into being. It was an old story reused by kings to justify their right to rule. Hatshepsut made it hers, a careful theological argument carved into stone. It wasn't just vanity, it was survival. In a world where female pharaohs were cosmic contradictions, Hatshepsut needed the gods on her side, and so she orchestrated a narrative of destiny, of being chosen, of being foretold. The priests of Amen at Karnak supported her claim. Whether out of genuine belief or political convenience, their backing gave her legitimacy. Egypt was not just a monarchy, was a temple state. To rule without priestly approval was to rule without the gods. She walked a fine line between reality and ritual, always balancing power with piety. Her public persona was one of majesty and confidence, but her reign, like all reigns, involved managing the mundane, controlling grain distribution, maintaining diplomatic ties, organizing labor forces for massive architectural projects. These were the things that didn't make it into dramatic historical summaries, but were essential for survival. Egypt, during her reign, was peaceful, prosperous, productive. She emphasized the Egyptian concept of order, balance, and justice. That may sound like an abstract spiritual principle, but in daily governance, it was practical. Ma'at meant fair taxation. It meant trade routes that ran on time. It meant food in granaries, law in the courts, and gold in the temple treasuries. And under her, Egypt thrived. But even at the height of her rule, she seemed to understand something unsettling. Phapsis was an illusion. Perhaps this was why she built so obsessively. Her greatest architectural achievement remains the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, nestled into the cliffs on the west bank of the Nile. Designed by her steward and architect Senameta, man whose closeness to Hatshepsut has inspired centuries of speculation, the temple was unlike anything built before. terraces, colonnades, long ramps flanked by sphinxes, scenes etched in reliefs, showing the journey to Punt, divine birth myths, and offerings to the gods. The structure was not just a tomb or a monument. It was a story told in stone. Sentiment, too, was a fascinating figure in her reign. He came from humble origins, not royal blood, and rose through merit and proximity to the queen. More than 20 statues of him have been found, many showing him protectively holding the Princess Nefer Hatshepsut's daughter. Nefer herself was likely being groomed for power before vanishing from the record. No tomb, no cause of death, silence. Some historians speculate that Senomit and Hatshepsut shared more than just political trust. Graffiti found in a worker's tomb depicts a royal woman and a man in an intimate scene. Perhaps slander, perhaps truth. But as with many women in power, history often reduces complexity to rumor. Whether they were lovers, allies, or something in between, their partnerships shaped the physical and political landscape of Egypt. And then, the quiet began, when Hatshepsut died, likely of natural causes, perhaps diabetes or cancer. Her burial was unceremoniously muddled. Her body was placed in the Valley of the Kings, but the original tomb meant for her had already been reassigned. It was a disruption of the carefully orchestrated funeral order she had likely planned for herself, and it only got stranger. Thutmose III took over fully now, no longer the child or the shadow pharaoh. He ruled for decades more, becoming a warrior king. He led campaigns into Syria and Nubia, expanded Egypt's borders, and earned a reputation as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. And somewhere during that long reign, he began to erase her, not violently, but systematically. Names were scratched out of walls, images were replaced, statues of her were mutilated or buried whole. In some cases, her face was literally chiseled off reliefs and replaced with a generic male profile. It wasn't about destroying her complete, it was about rewriting her into invisibility. Why? Theories persist. Some suggest that Thutmose III held a grudge, that being sidelined during his youth made him resentful. But the delay in erasure suggests otherwise. He waited nearly 20 years after her death to begin. Others believed the priesthood or court advisors feared that Hatshepsut's reign set a dangerous precedent, that if a woman could rule so effectively, what might future queens attempt? And so they acted not to punish her, but to protect the narrative. There's also a more clinical explanation. Ancient Egyptian kings often cleaned up dynastic records to present a neat, unbroken line of male succession. Hatshepsut was an anomaly in the royal sequence. The erasure may have been bureaucratic, not personal, but even if her name was cut from stone, her influence could not be. The buildings remained. The economic stability lingered. The memory, like dust in the cracks, refused to settle. It would take thousands of years for modern archaeology to piece her back together. In 1903, a British archaeologist named Howard Carter Better, known for discovering Tutankhamun's tomb, uncovered a mysterious, unmarked sarcophagus in the Valley of the Kings. For decades, the mummy inside was unidentified. Only in the 2000s did CT scans and DNA analysis confirm it was likely Hatshepsut, matched to a tooth found in a box labeled with her name. She had been hidden in plain sight. Again, even in death, even in rediscovery, she had to be identified through scraps through a missing tooth, a mismatched bone, a forgotten box on a museum shelf. It is a strange thing, isn't it, to rule the richest empire of your time, and still be a question mark in your own legacy. A woman who shaped the course of a civilization, and whose story was nearly erased with a chisel. But her silence was not complete. There are still walls that whisper her name, still corridors where her feet once echoed, and still obelisks that point to a sky she dared to rule beneath. So now the question lingers, unsettling and slow. Is her erasure an accident of history or a warning to others. Asterisk. In the Valley of the Kings, where the cliffs rise like cracked parchment and the sun casts long shadows over the tombs of pharaohs, there is a chamber once meant to be forgotten. No gold, no extravagant inscriptions announcing its inhabitant, just the scent of limestone and time. It is here, quietly, without ceremony, that the body of Hatshepsut may have rested, unacknowledged for centuries. The final chapter of her life was not a dramatic fall. There were no rebellions, no murders, no grand betrayals. She simply vanished from life, from history, from memory. But if you pause here, at this edge of silence, something strange begins to happen. The scale of her life since sheer depths comes, into focus only when placed beside the effort required to erase it. You do not try to erase someone, who did nothing worth remembering. Her tomb had originally been designed for grandeur, but when she died, something shifted. Her sarcophagus was moved, her resting place was changed, and in the years following, her legacy was carved away like wrought from wood, with care, with patience, and with an almost obsessive thoroughness. Yet the erasure was flawed. Despite chiseled names and broken statues, her story endured, quietly, like water finding its way through cracks in stone. Some scholars believe her stepson, Thutmose III, later, had a change of heart, that the same ruler who erased her name allowed her buildings to remain standing, that he preserved the records of her accomplishments under veiled terms. Mentioning the king in masculine form, while the context still whispered Hatshepsut. If true, it suggests a complex relationship, one of rivalry, inheritance, and perhaps reluctant admiration. And in truth, her legacy never really belonged to those who tried to contain it. It belongs to the stone, to the sand, to the sunlight that warms the columns of Deir el-Bahari every morning. Thousands of years later, tourists shuffle quietly through those ancient courtyards. Their feet scrape dust across the flagstones. They lift their eyes to the walls, where boats to Punt still sail, where divine birth is still etched, where the king, with a woman's face, still offers incense to Amen. They may not always know her story in full, but they feel her presence. In 2007, her mommy long misidentified was finally confirmed. CT scans showed signs of bone cancer and an abscessed tooth, a painful end likely eased by the best medicine Egypt had to offer. Her arm was folded across, her chest in the royal pose. Even in death, she had kept her dignity. But perhaps the most revealing discovery was not in the body, but in the coffin. On the outside, it bore no grand titles, no triumphal epithets. It was humble, simple, labeled only with her name, scratched faintly onto the side of a small box. A box that had survived every campaign to destroy her. And that box still exists. It sits in a museum under soft lighting, behind glass that reflects the curious faces of modern visitors. Inside is a molar, a fragment of her jaw, a reminder that history is often rebuilt one tooth at a time. We may never know what Hatshepsut felt as she governed, whether she feared the erasure, whether she hoped her buildings would speak louder than her enemies, whether she trusted her story would survive the long, dry centuries ahead. But we do know what she did. She ruled, not as a queen, not as a consort, not as a regent. She ruled as pharaoh. She restructured temples, reopened ancient trade routes, balanced Egypt's economy, sponsored art, expanded the priesthood, and then she vanished. Her life is a paradox of presence and absence. It's an empire built by a woman who could not be named as one, a memory erased by those who could not bear its reality, a legacy that now whispers louder than any of theirs. Her greatest monuments are still standing, and a name, once scratched off every stone, is now carved into textbooks, tour guides, and the minds of millions. So tonight, as you rested, Imagine the dry wind sweeping through those columns. Imagine the scent of hot stone and incense. Imagine a figure in white linen standing at the edge of the Nile, staring into eternity. Not a queen, not a wife, but a king. And ask yourself, gently, as sleep begins to settle, what other stories have been buried, not by time, but by intention. Asterisk, you may have walked the Roman Forum in your mind, columns and arches rising like ribs from a fallen beast, sunlit plazas echoing with imagined footsteps of emperors. But what few recall is that some of the most permanent decisions in Roman history were made not by those who strutted in togas, but by those who waited just behind the doors. Livia Drusilla never wore a laurel crown. She never issued a decree. She never led a legion. And yet, Rome, its order, its dynasties, its very imperial identity was shaped by the quiet pressure of her presence. She was born in 58 BCE, key into the patrician Claudian family, one of the oldest in Rome. Her birth name, Livia Drusilla, echoed with noble bloodlines and ancestral pride. At 15, she married Tiberius Claudius Nero, her cousin, and bore him a son, the future emperor Tiberius. It could have ended there. A quiet noblewoman, political pawn in a collapsing republic. But in 39 BCE, during one of Rome's many spasms of civil war, something extraordinary happened. She divorced her husband while still pregnant and married Gaius Octavius Bator, known to history as Octavian, the future Augustus, first emperor of Rome. It was a union that shocked conservative sensibilities. Livia, still visibly carrying her ex-husband's child, stood beside her new husband at the altar. In a culture that prized modesty and propriety for women, this marriage was, by all standards, scandalous. And yet, it lasted over 50 years. Octavian, ambitious, calculating, brilliant, recognized in Livia a partner who was not only noble in blood, but formidable in intellect. She didn't merely accompany him through his rise from triumvir to emperor. She helped shape that rise, but her tools were not the sword or the law. Her realm was perception. She cultivated an image of the ideal Roman matron, loyal, modest, austere. She wore simple dresses, wove her own garments, was seen supervising the household duties. In the public eye, she was the counterpoint to Cleopatra's extravagance, the embodiment of Roman virtue. But beneath the folds of linen, behind the smile frozen in marble busts, lay a mind attuned to politics like a veteran general. Livia never issued edicts, but her advice was valued at the highest levels of the state. Augustus, who would claim divine lineage and total power, was said to never make a major decision without consulting her. She had no formal office, no public title, and yet the Senate bowed when she entered a room. When asked about his success, Augustus often said he found peace at home. What he didn't say, but what we now suspect, that the peace came from the careful hands of a wife who managed far more than the hearth. She had a way of making power invisible, of cloaking authority in virtue. The public adored her. Poets praised her. Statues of her stood beside Augustus in temples. Coins bore her likeness. And yet, no act of violence or open ambition was ever officially tied to her name. It was always someone else. Whispers tell of her quiet interventions in court politics, rivals who faded from favor, alliances brokered over family dinners. A son, Tiberius, raised with the utmost precision for a future he seemed reluctant to inherit. But these are just echoes. The real Livia is hard to find, not because she left no trace, but because her trace was always intentional. Every gesture, every absence was part of the performance. And yet, even the most curated appearances begin to crack when succession is at stake. Augustus had children and grandchildren, but one by one, they disappeared. Lucius and Gaius Caesar, his favorite grandsons, died young. The circumstances that some found ... convenient. Agrippa Postumus, another heir, was exiled and executed shortly after Augustus's death, all while Livia's own son, Tiberius, slowly moved closer to the throne. Coincidence, misfortune, or subtle engineering? Contemporary sources never accuse her directly, but later historians, particularly Tacitus and Cassius Dio, paint her as a master manipulator, a woman whose power was so total it left no fingerprints. Still, they may not be reliable. These were men writing under later emperors, decades removed from Livia's time, often with axes to grind. What we do know is that she survived longer than Augustus, longer than nearly all her rivals, and she did so without ever standing in front of a legion or giving a speech in the Senate. She governed through proximity, through trust, through reputation. It is easy to dismiss that kind of power, quiet, domestic, indirect. But when the Republic fell and the empire rose, and the bloodlines of rulers were cemented for centuries, Livia Drusilla stood at the very heart of that transformation. The irony is that she, too, was almost forgotten. After her death, Curius hesitated to deify her despite her many years of careful service. He may have resented her control, her ambitions, or her machinations. It would be left to her grandson Caligula to finally grant her divine honors. But even then, her memory was contested. It flickered in and out of favor. Sometimes she was a saint, sometimes a serpent, and across it all, her face remained calm, controlled. It's like marble. So we return to the question, how much of Rome's history was not written in decrees, but in glances, in dinners, in whispers? And how do we measure power that was never meant to leave a record? Asterisk power in ancient Rome was not always declared from a balcony. Sometimes it waited in the atrium, head bowed, hands folded. Wrapped in domestic virtue, Livia Drusilla mastered this performance to such perfection that even now, over 2,000 years later, we are still trying to separate the mask from the woman. By the time her husband Octavian became Augustus, Rome's first emperor, Livia was already more than a wife. She was a symbol, a walking embodiment of what the new regime wanted to promise the Roman people: stability, modesty, legacy. Rome had been bleeding for decades. Civil wars, assassinations, broken institutions. The Republic had collapsed under its own contradictions. And Augustus emerged from the rubble, not just as a ruler, but as the healer of the state. His reign needed legitimacy, something pure, enduring, familial. Livia provided that. She presented a new model of womanhood, austere, quiet, dutiful. She didn't wear the lavish silks of Eastern queens or dye her hair with imported colors. She spun her own wool, attended ceremonies, walked alongside Augustus in public hallways, just a step behind. And yet, she was never passive. Her private correspondence, now lost, was known to carry influence. Letters in her elegant handwriting could settle legal disputes, sway votes, and arrange marriages between Rome's elite families. No title adorned these letters, but they carried weight nonetheless. Livia became the axis around which court alliances turned, and at the heart of her long-term strategy was the matter of succession. Augustus had no biological sons. Livia had two, Tiberius and Drusus, born from her first marriage. While Augustus loved Drusus, it was Tiberius, reserved, competent, dutiful, who would become her great project. Augustus initially favored his friend and General Agrippa as successor. After Agrippa's death, he turned his hopes to Agrippa's sons, Gaius and Lucius, both young, energetic, widely admired. But they died unexpectedly, one in Lycia, the other in Gaul. Illness, perhaps, but the closeness of timing and the political convenience for Tiberius led to quiet speculation. Livia said nothing. Tiberius, once reluctant, returned from self-imposed exile and accepted his place as Augustus's heir, Agrippa Posthumous. The last of the favorite grandsons was banished under vague charges of misconduct. No public trial, no formal declaration. He was sent to an island. Later, he was executed under mysterious circumstances just days after Augustus's death. Livia was present for all of it. She never spoke on the matter, and that silence was louder than any decree. When Augustus died in 14 CE, he left behind not just an empire, but a carefully arranged future. In his will, he named Livia co-heir to a third of his property. He also formally adopted her into the Julian family, granting her the name Julia Augusta. In effect, he made her part of the imperial dynasty by law. No Roman woman had ever held such a position. Livia now commanded immense wealth, political connections, and moral authority. She was mother to the emperor, widow of the first divine Caesar, and the matriarch of Rome's most powerful family. Yet, with power came friction. Tiberius, now emperor, did not enjoy sharing the spotlight. The relationship soured. Livia's influence at court remained too strong for the new emperor's likings. He often deferred to her in public matters, but privately resented her. Ancient sources suggest he referred to her sarcastically as the mother of the world. She was given the title Augusta by the Senate, but Tiberius blocked several other honors she was due. He refused to let her be deified during her lifetime, when she fell ill and eventually died in 29 CE. Tiberius did not attend her funeral. He did not deliver her eulogy. The woman who had once shaped the empire's future was buried quietly, with only a faint echo of state recognition. But history does not always obey the wishes of emperors. Years later, her grandson, Caligula, young, unpredictable, restored her public memory. He arranged for her deification. Coins once again bore her image. Statues were erected. Temples were renamed. The image of Livia Drusilla was reborn. Still serene, still modest, still untouchable. Yet the question remains, was she truly the modest wife history carved in marble? Or was she the architect of an imperial order? The sources are conflicted. The historian Tacitus paints her as ambitious, cold, manipulative, a woman who destroyed rivals and arranged deaths behind closed doors. Tacitus wrote under emperors who despised women in power. Dio Cassius, writing later, describes her as politically active and wise. He suggests she was not ruthless, but strategic, not cruel, but aware of Rome's brutal necessities. What we do know is this: Livia never led a charge, but she never addressed the Senate. She never signed a law, and yet she changed the course of Roman history more than many who did. So, how do we define power when it's draped in domesticity, when it whispers instead of commands, when it survives not by conquest, but by presence? Many times in history have the softest voices steered the hardest empires. She lived longer than most women of her time. Longer than her husband, longer than many of her rivals, longer even than some of the emperors she helped shape. Livia Drusilla lived into her 80s and almost mythical age in the brutal world of Roman politics, where few died naturally and fewer still were mourned without caution. And yet, her legacy is not a clear monument. It is a puzzle, a story told in fragments. It's a figure built from both admiration and suspicion, a portrait carved into coins, but also scratched into gossip. After her death in 29 CE, Livia's name flickered through Roman memory like a torch in wind. Her son, Emperor Tiberius, withheld many of the honors Augustus had intended for her. The Senate had voted to bestow a golden statue in her likeness and a ceremonial chariot in the Circus Maximus, but Tiberius delayed and obstructed. Whether out of resentment, political tension, or emotional fatigue, he offered her no triumph, She was buried with Augustus in the imperial mausoleum, but quietly, without spectacle, without procession, for a woman who had served as the empire's silent foundation. The end was almost private, but the foundations of Rome are not easily ignored. 2 generations later, Livia's legacy would rise again like a marble statue lifted from dust. Her grandson, Caligula, publicly praised her memory. Her great-grandson, Claudius, went further. He deified her. Temples were built in her name. Her cult was revived. Priests were appointed. Sacrifices were made. She became divine Julia Augusta goddess of family, of virtue, of memory. But the act of deification was not only religious, it was political. Claudius owed much of his position to the Claudian lineage that Livia had carefully preserved. To honor her was to validate his rule, just as Augustus had once honored her to validate his own. Even in death, Livia was useful. But what did she believe in? Asterisk. She left no diary, no personal letters survive. What we have is sculpted. Inscriptions, statues, coins, each image showing the same expression, serene, composed, perfect. And yet, behind the stone, there is the ghost of a real woman. One who navigated the collapse of the Republic, the rise of an empire, and the uncertain experiment of dynastic succession. Her influence lay not in revolution, but in preservation. Asterisk. While others spilled blood to win power, Livia preserved it through patience, through motherhood, through reputation, through the curated image of perfect Roman femininity. Even when wielding authority behind closed doors, she built bridges between generations, from Augustus to Tiberius, from Tiberius to Caligula, from Caligula to Claudius. Rome endured, in part, because she managed the cracks. But even this praise is double-edged. Was she calculating or cautious? Loving or strategic? Did she remove rivals to protect her son or merely outlast them? We will never know. The history books say she was honored, and then they move on. Her name appears less often than those of her male counterparts, and yet her shadow lingers in every imperial decision that followed. She was the blueprint for imperial womanhood, emulated, feared, repeated. Later empresses like Agrippina the Younger and Julia Dumna would inherit her image and adapt it. Some leaned into her subtlety. Others abandoned it altogether and seized power publicly, often at their own peril. In Livia's quiet life, there is a lesson, one not taught on battlefields or in speeches. It is about the power of waiting, of observing, of moving without being seen. It is about the cost of influence without authorship, because in the end, her story was not written by her. It was written by the men who outlived her, by the senators who feared her, by the historians who didn't trust her, by the descendants who used her memory to legitimize themselves. And yet, she endures, not in glory, not in myth, but in marble faces placed beside emperors, in the records of marriages she arranged, in the very shape of the empire that rose and did not collapse after Augustus's death. Perhaps that was her greatest triumph. Rome did not fall when Augustus died. It kept breathing, slowly, steadily, through the veins she had protected. And now, centuries later, in the quiet moments before sleep, you are remembering her again. The woman who never ruled, but ruled everything. The woman whose silence bent the empire toward survival. So we ask, as the memory of her face fades once more into the calm night, how much of history belongs to those who were never allowed to speak? Asterisk. The Niger River bends through West Africa like a serpent of silt and memory, its slow curves carving fertile earth, trading roots and centuries of forgotten names. On its banks once rose the Mali Empire, a vast domain of gold and scholars, merchants and masons, stretching from the Atlantic coast deep into the Sahel. It was a place of kingdoms hidden beneath dust and canopy, where libraries were built out of mud and the wealth of kings could tilt the economy of entire continents. And among these kings, hidden just beneath their robes of fame, was a queen. Her name was Kasi, a wife, co-ruler, and then, quietly, monarch in all but title. To understand her life is to understand how empires record power and how easily they forget the hands that held it steady. We begin in the early 1300s. During the reign of Mansa Musa, one of the wealthiest men to have ever lived. Musa is known for his pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, during which he famously distributed so much gold that it caused inflation in Cairo. His name lives on in textbooks and economic lore. But before Musa became emperor, he was not the direct heir, and neither was his wife Kasi meant to rule. She was a princess from the royal Qaeda clan, married to Musa during his years as a regional governor. At that time, the empire was ruled by Musa's predecessor, Mansa Abubakari, a mysterious figure who, according to later accounts, may have sailed into the Atlantic in search of unknown lands, never to return. When Musa ascended the throne, it was not through war or birthright alone. It was through political alignment, through legitimacy drawn partly from his marriage to Kasi. His lineage helped cement his claim. Kasi was not a ceremonial partner. She was the daughter of one of Mali's most powerful noble lines. Her ties to the Keita family were crucial in maintaining loyalty among the empire's inner court and southern provinces. Musa's authority relied on more than gold did, required stability, and Kasi was his quiet architect, while Musa traveled across deserts to Mecca. Through Cairo, Kasi remained in the capital of Niani. She governed in his absence. This was not unusual in Mali. The concept of a co-rulership, kafo, existed quietly in oral traditions. Women could hold court, resolve disputes, manage trade networks, oversee agriculture, especially when the male monarch was away. But their names rarely entered official genealogies. They ruled in practice. K's administration was remembered in oral histories collected centuries later by Griot's West African storytellers and record keepers. They spoke of her fairness in market regulation, her protection of farmers during lean seasons, and her wise distribution of grain stores during drought. In an empire where food security was the backbone of survival, her judgment was as critical as gold. It is said that while Musa flooded the streets of Cairo with coins, Kasi managed the actual lifeblood of Mali: rice, millet, cattle, and salt. The story goes that her palace was open to petitioners once a week, a practice that mirrored Islamic and local customs alike. She wore indigo robes, dyed from native plants, and her council included elder women and merchants, as well as scribes and qadis trained in Islamic law. Her governance blended the old with the new, ancestral wisdom with imported religion, but no scrolls in Timbuktu bear her signature. No coins bear her image. No traveler from Morocco or Spain wrote her name into their diaries. Why? Perhaps because she did not leave Mali. She did not make a pilgrimage. She did not seek a mosque in Cairo or an audience in the Maghreb. Her power remained fixed in Niani, steady and local. And an empire is built on outward showings of might and wealth. That kind of power is often ignored. Yet, without her, the Mali Empire may have crumbled. The years surrounding Musa's pilgrimage were difficult. His long absence disrupted court routines. Trade caravans were overburdened. Currency became unstable. The gold Musa spent abroad had to be replenished at home, and the domestic economy needed immediate care. Kasi stabilized it. While Musa was away, she reestablished trade routes with local Hausa cities. She secured alliances with Fulani pastoralists, ensuring livestock remained flowing into central Mali. And she oversaw the distribution of emergency food during a series of poor harvests. Later, Griot traditions say she once personally walked the granaries before market days, checking the measures of rice herself. But these were not stories meant to glorify. They were stories told by women, passed in courtyard songs, repeated in evenings beside cooking fires. Quiet stories, the kind that do not get inscribed in Arabic, ink, or written onto scrolls shipped northward. After Musa returned, he continued to rule with renewed wealth and religious prestige. He built mosques, libraries, and schools. He imported architects from Egypt and scholars from Andalusia. The teen of Mali spread further, but Cassie's role receded. We do not know if she chose silence or if it was imposed on her, whether she stepped aside willingly or whether history gently pushed her off the stage. What we do know is this: when Musa died in 1337, the succession of power became shaky. The empire began its slow fragmentation. The golden age flickered, and in many villages across Mali, elders say things were never quite as orderly as they were under Kazi's time. The Griots remember her not as a queen, but as something quieter, a woman who made the grain flow when the gold vanished, a woman who kept the court whole when the emperor wandered. And so the question sits like dust on ancient cloth. Is history made only by those who travel, or also by those who stay and keep the world turning? Asterisk. The Empire of Mali in the 14th century shimmered with trade. Gold flowed from Bambouk and Bure. Salt came in from Tagaza, and ivory, kola, and cloth wound their way down the Niger. But no trade was more quietly essential than grain, and no steward of that grain was more trusted than Cassie. Mali's wealth dazzled foreigners, especially those who heard tales of Mansa Musa's golden pilgrimage. But travelers like Ibn Battuta, who came to West Africa decades later, often misunderstood the roots of its stability. They saw the palaces, the wealth, the mosques, but what they missed, what they didn't write down, was how the society held together between the gold mines and the Islamic schools. It was rice, sorghum, millet. It was the rhythms of farming, planting, harvest, the discipline of granary records, the delicate trust between rulers and farmers, traders and elders. And it was women like Kasai who often kept those systems running, while Musa reorganized at least legal structure under Islamic scholars. Kasai maintained the older foundation's consensus building, oral mediation, kin-based governance. She didn't reject Islam. In fact, she supported its institutions, funded Islamic schools, and hosted visiting scholars. But she also continued to rely on traditional methods of leadership: elders, councils, clan authority, and ritual diplomacy. In this dual system, her presence was irreplaceable. She mediated conflicts between newly converted Muslim towns and older animist villages. She regulated market prices when traders tried to take advantage of shortages. She arranged marriages between rival noble families. All without formal decrees, all without armies. In the city of Niani, she was known not as Amira or queen, but simply as Kazi said, with reverence like a title unto itself. Asterisk. In the Griot tradition, there is a tale of a dry season that struck during Musa's pilgrimage. The crops failed, the river dropped, and hunger crept in. Traders began hoarding. Prices rose. Panic set in. Kazi responded not with punishment, but with presence. She traveled by palanquin to the market herself. The crowd parted. She walked to the scales and weighed a sack of millet. Then she turned to the crowd and calmly announced the fair price for a market day's worth. That price became the standard for the rest of the season. Whether the story is literal or not matters little. What matters is that Kazi was seen as a moral center. Her word carried force not through fear, but through trust. Mali's society allowed such things in quiet ways. Women in West Africa traditionally held important roles in market regulation, agriculture, and diplomacy, though they were rarely featured in written Islamic histories. Oral tradition suggests that elite women were instrumental in preserving social order, especially when dynastic politics turned unstable. Kasi represented the height of this tradition. It's important to note that her influence was not born from rebellion. She didn't fight against the structure, she worked within it, expanded it, quietly redrew its boundaries. She gave Mali the appearance of calm, while the foundations shifted beneath. When Musa returned from pilgrimage, he was more pious, more focused on religious transformation. Timbuktu expanded. Sankar Mosque flourished. Scholars and judges were imported from Cairo and Fez, but he returned to an empire that was still intact, still functioning because someone had tended its interior. That someone was Kasi. Yet, with Musa's renewed energy came a reshaping of the court. New advisors, many foreign-trained, began to dominate the palace. The role of women in court governance diminished. Islamic codes of behavior increasingly marginalized the public role of women like Kasi. Her influence began to recede, not through exile or disgrace. Some sources suggest that when Musa's son, Mansa, Maga, succeeded him, Kasi withdrew from the court. Kasi continued as an elder stateswoman, advising in the background, but her name disappears from most chronicles after Musa's death. It is in the silences that her legacy echoes most clearly. Later generations remembered her not through titles, but through outcomes, a generation of relative peace. Well-fed provinces. Merchants who spoke of a woman's years as a phrase meaning times of stability. Yet even the griots, protectors of oral history, sometimes struggled to name her directly. Male rulers were remembered for conquest, for expansion, for pilgrimage. Women like Kasi were remembered for preservation, and preservation leaves fewer marks. The granaries she filled are long gone. The courtyards she ruled from have crumbled. The names of her advisors are lost to the wind. But the question remains, when? The kings left to chase gold, who kept the land from falling apart. Asterisk, the twilight of Kasi's influence is not marked by any single event. There was no fall from grace, no public disgrace, no rebellion, only the slow, sedimentary layering of forgetfulness. One generation passed into the next, and as they recorded the deeds of emperors, scholars, and generals, they left the weaver of balance unwritten. Not because she didn't matter, but because her power had been quiet. Mali, in the years after Mansa Musa's death, did not collapse outright. It continued for decades as one of Africa's great empires, but the seams began to show. Succession disputes destabilized court politics. Trade routes became more contested. Provinces, once held by diplomacy, began to drift into local autonomy, and something else faded too. The practice of informal kurul, the kafo that had allowed women like Sti to govern and practice, lost its space in the imperial structure. Foreign-trained Islamic scholars, while vital in codifying law and advancing literacy, brought with them legal codes that limited public leadership roles for women. And so, piece by piece, the old model fell away. By the late 14th century, no woman is recorded as holding similar authority in Mali. And yet, the ripple of Kasi's choices moved forward. Some Griot lineages still recite her name, not always with clarity, and not always in full detail, but always with a tone of calm and reverence. They describe her years as a time when the rivers ran smooth and the markets hummed with order, when the court ruled fairly, not with conquest, but with confidence, among the oral traditions of certain man-speaking communities. There are faint stories of a mother of the grain who saved the empire during the hot years. She is said to have worn robes dyed the color of dried leaves and spoken only when necessary. And that image has survived, not in ink, not in inscription, but in rhythm, in the cadence of women's songs, sung during harvest, in the advice passed down in marketplaces. Don't sell what the mother would not weigh. In the way village elders speak of Kasi's hands, as if the land itself still bears her fingerprints. The great irony is that Mali's most famous ruler, Mansa Musa, is often taught in classrooms far beyond Africa. His wealth, his pilgrimage, his impact on global economics These are recognized and repeated. Gold still glitters in imagination. But Kazi, she is rarely mentioned. Even in West African studies, her name appears only fleetingly, if at all tucked into oral histories. Buried in footnotes, spoken mostly by those who still live near where Niani once stood. There is no statue of her, no coin, no preserved manuscript in the libraries of Timbuktu. Yet her legacy is felt in the invisible things, in the balance between tradition and reform. In the space she carved out for female governance in an empire that would soon forget such space existed. In the knowledge that empires rise not only on conquest, but on preservation. Historians have debated whether Kazi should be called a queen regnant, coroller, or simply a royal consort. But the titles miss the point. She ruled. Whether named or unnamed, whether seen or obscured, whether written or only remembered in the hush of memory. And so now, in the quiet hours of your own evening, you brought her name back to life again. Cassie, the grainkeeper, the matriarch, the one who stayed when others left. And perhaps that is the most haunting question of all: how many more rulers like her are lost? Not because they lacked greatness, but because they ruled gently, and no one thought to write it down. Asterisk, in the city of Luyang, where the yellow river bends like a brushstroke through dusty plains, stood a palace of red lacquer and jade tiles. It was a city of scholars and bureaucrats, of poets and courtesans, of eunuchs and mandarins, all moving quietly through corridors of hierarchy and ritual. It was also the city where a girl named Wu Xiao once walked with eyes downcast and sleeves properly folded, trained from childhood to disappear into the background. But Wu Xiao would not remain in the background for long. Born in 624 CE to a wealthy but non-noble family, Wu Xiao's leader, known as Wu Jiaxin, was not born to rule. Her father, Wu Jiaxin, Wu was a timber merchant who had worked his way into the aristocracy through military service. He ensured that his daughter was unusually well educated for her time. She learned to read and write skills most girls, even elite ones, were not expected to master. She studied history, Confucian texts, and poetry. And quietly, in her father's house, she learned the language of power. At the age of 14, she was sent to the imperial palace to serve as a concubine of Emperor Taizong. There, among hundreds of women, she was known simply as Mei Ren Wu, Lady Wu, the Beauty. She did not rank high in the emperor's favor. He preferred others. She was young, quiet, and observant. But those years shaped her understanding of court life, the rhythms of favor and exile, the alliances whispered through painted screens, the dangers of being seen too soon. When Emperor Taizong died in 649, his concubines, those without children, were sent to Buddhist convents, as was the tradition. Wu entered a nunnery, shaved her head, disappeared from the palace. But her story was not over. Within a year, the new Emperor Taizong's son, Emperor Gaozong, visited the convent and summoned her back to court. She was now older, wiser, and dangerously aware of how power moved. Gaozong had known Wu during his father's reign. Some say they had an affair. Others believe he simply remembered her intelligence. Either way, Wu Zhao returned, not as a forgotten nun, but as a favored concubine, and soon she began to rise. She bore the emperor children. She was clever in conversation. She charmed ministers and neutralized rivals, and, crucially, she made herself useful. Gaozong, plagued by chronic illness and a preference for leisure over governance, leaned on her more and more. She began attending court sessions in his place, reviewing petitions, drafting edicts, meeting foreign emissaries behind screens. But a concubine, even a favorite one, could not rule outright so. Wu Xiao rewrote the rules. Asterisk, she accused the Empress Wang of poisoning her newborn daughter, a child who had mysteriously died in the nursery. Whether the accusation was true remains unknown. The outcome was clear. Empress Wang was removed. Q. Xiao took her place. She was now Empress Wu, title with symbolic weight, but still tethered to her husband's authority. For now, asterisk. From behind the veil, she ran the court. She restructured the bureaucracy to favor merit over aristocracy. She supported scholars who had no noble blood. She expanded the examination system to include people from less privileged regions. These acts made her enemies, but also built her a base. She funded Buddhist temples and commissioned scriptures that portrayed female figures in divine roles. In some, she was depicted as a reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. This was not just piety, it was political theology. She was creating the spiritual argument for her authority. When Emperor Gozan's health declined further, Wu Zhao's role became overt. She held open court. Ministers bowed to her, not him. She issued commands in his name, but everyone knew whose will guided them. And when he died in 683, she installed her son as puppet emperor, only to remove him later. Then she crowned herself emperor in her own right, the first and only woman in Chinese history to do so. Not empress regent, not mother of the emperor, but emperor. She founded a new dynasty, the Zhou, interrupting the attempts for 15 years. The Confucian scholars were horrified. Women, according to orthodox teachings, were to be obedient, silent, and confined to the domestic realm. Wu Xiao shattered every one of those rules. She didn't just rule in a man's place. She redefined what ruling could look like. And yet, she ruled effectively. She improved agricultural policy, reduced taxes on peasants, reorganized land distribution, encouraged Buddhist scholarship, expanded China's diplomatic reach into Central Asia. Her court was brutal. At times ministers were exiled or executed. Secret police enforced her decrees, but it was not chaos, piss, agency, and in some ways, it was stability. But when you rewrite the rules, the old guard never forgets, and they wait, even as Wu Zhao aged, even as her vision dimmed and her health declined. The Confucian scholars began to whisper again. She had ruled for decades, but they were already sharpening the knives of memory by the time she abdicated in 705. Just months before her death, the restoration of the Tang dynasty was already underway. Her enemies erased her reforms. Her edicts were annulled. Her name was scrubbed from temples and histories. In official records, she became a footnote. A dangerous example, a warning, and yet she left a final act of resistance. Her tomb at Kinling, carved into a mountain beside her husband's, contains an empty stilia blank stone where her epitaph should be. No words, no summary, no praise. Historians have debated. Its meaning was it left empty by decree. A challenge to future generations to write their own truth, a refusal to allow others to shape her story. Or was it the final insult by those who refused to record her? No one knows for certain, but there it stands, tall, heavy, silent, just like the woman it was meant to contain. And so we ask, what does it mean to rule a country and still be denied the right to be remembered in your own words? Asterisk, Wu Cixin's rise was already complete by the time most of her opponents realized what had happened. She didn't storm the gates. She didn't lead armies or seize the palace by force. Instead, she ruled from within, turning the symbols of patriarchy to her favor, wielding soft power until it hardened into something immovable. And when she finally took the title of Wang the Emperor, it wasn't a sudden coup. It was the result of years of incremental change, carefully staged appearances, and the slow erosion of male authority in her presence. After Gaozong's death in 683, she installed her son, Zhangzong, as emperor. But when he showed signs of independence, she swiftly deposed him. She replaced him with another son, Rizong younger, more malleable. Both would serve only as shadows behind the screen. Wu Cixin ruled in her own name from 690 onward. The Zhou dynasty she founded, named after the ancient Zhou of Chinese antiquity, was a calculated choice. By invoking the Zhou, she connected herself with an earlier golden age, a time of sage kings and righteous governance. She wasn't claiming innovation, she was claiming restoration. But her rule was anything but traditional. She placed her family, the Wu clan, into positions of power. Ministers and generals loyal to her were promoted. Dissenters were removed. The civil service, once dominated by aristocratic clans, was opened up to new talent, particularly from the provinces. This eroded the old family's control and gave her a base of support among scholars and bureaucrats who owed their rise to her, and yet who understood appearances. She didn't dismantle the rituals of court life. She didn't abolish Confucianism, even though it condemned female rule. Instead, she layered her authority with religious symbolism drawn from Buddhism and Buddhist texts of the period. Female bodhisattvas emerged in prominent roles. Wu commissioned the Great Cloud Sutra, which predicted the arrival of a female ruler who would bring salvation and justice to the world. Her name appeared in these texts, thinly veiled, as the fulfillment of prophecy. She also built, in the city of Luoyang, her favorite capital, she commissioned towering Buddhist statues, including the grand-seated Buddha at the Longmen Grottos, whose serene face is said to resemble her own, carved into limestone, 50 feet tall. The statue remains even today, quiet face watching across centuries, but no power remains unchallenged forever. Wu's later years were marked by illness and growing paranoia. The secret police became more active. Whispered plots were uncovered or imagined. Court officials were accused, tortured, and exiled. Some deserved it. Many did not. Her favor shifted more frequently. Younger lovers, Zhang Yitzi and Zhang Chengsong, rose in prominence, causing scandal among officials. They were handsome, poetic, attentive. Wu, now in her 70s, relied on them not just for companionship, but for political advice. Influence was deeply resented. The Confucian historians of later generations would seize on these relationships to diminish her legacy. They portrayed her as corrupt, licentious, unnatural. They described her reign as a distortion of the moral order, a cautionary tale of what happens when women rise too far. But beneath the bias lies a different truth, even in her final years. Wu remained clear-eyed about governance. She oversaw the compilation of official histories. She expanded the imperial examination system. She instituted agricultural reforms and closely monitored grain distribution, aware, always, that a hungry people could turn volatile, and the people, Lei, did not rise against her. In fact, there's little evidence of popular rebellion during her reign. She may have alienated elites, but she kept the state functioning. Taxes were collected, canals were maintained, borders were held. It was the court, not the empire, that began to fracture in 705. When Wu was nearing her deathbed, a group of ministers staged a quiet palace coup. They killed the Zhang brothers and forced Wu to abdicate. Son Zhangzong was reinstated as emperor. Wu was granted the honorary title of Emperor Emeritus, but her power was gone. She died not long after, still residing within the palace grounds. What followed was a systematic reshaping of her memory. The Zhou dynasty she founded was officially erased. Her name was removed from state documents. Her reforms were rolled back. Her image, once cast in bronze and stone, was quietly replaced by portraits of returning king rulers. But the contradictions were never resolved. Later, historians could not decide whether to vilify or admire her. The Song dynasty would denounce her as a usurper. The Ming and Qing would revive her image as a cautionary tale. Modern Chinese history paints her as a capable administrator and a symbol of complex femininity in a male-dominated past. And through it all, that empty stele at Kinling remains. No official words, No final say, just a blank stone. A question. And perhaps that's fitting, because to write a final summary of Wu Zixin is to miss the point. Her story is not about conquest, or love, or betrayal. It's about adaptation, precision, endurance. She ruled a vast, patriarchal empire by mastering its contradictions. She enforced the rules while slowly breaking them. She honored the system as she replaced it, and she won, not by shouting, but by whispering, loud enough to be heard through veils of incense and parchment. So now we ask, if you rule a nation, reshape its politics, rewrite its theology, and leave behind an empire that remembers you in silence, did you ever truly leave? Asterisk in the end? What? Zixin returned to stone, but not 2 words. She was buried in a twin tomb, nestled between 2 hills, alongside her husband, Gozong. The complex at Kinlink, massive and fortified, housed the remains of emperors, princes, ministers, each marked by stele praising their deeds, summarizing their lives in ornate Confucian prose, except hers, her stele, the largest of them. All remains blank, not scratched out, not broken, just never written, no dates, no titles, no lines of remembrance, just a smooth face of stone left uncarved, life unwritten, or perhaps unwritable. Some believe the blank stele was her own commander, final challenge to future generations to decide her worth. Others argue it was her enemy's insult, refusal to validate her reign, to admit that a woman had ruled as emperor and done it well. Both explanations feel plausible. Both are equally unsettling, because, in truth, Wu Zixin's rule did not end when she died. It lingered. The Tang court reinstated its previous rulers. Confucian norms returned. Her family members were dismissed or exiled. Ministers who had supported her quietly faded into retirement. Historians began crafting the official version of her reign, laced with discomfort, suspicion, and moral outrage. They portrayed her as a seductress, tyrant, a cautionary example, asterisk. They called her rise unnatural, her governance cruel, her personal life disgraceful, but they couldn't deny what she had done. She had expanded China's influence westward, key into the Silk Road corridors. Key, she had opened court appointments to men of lower birth, weakening the old aristocracy's grip on power. She had protected Buddhist institutions, providing them with the resources to grow into cultural and educational centers. She had kept the empire stable during succession crises, droughts, factional feuds. No rebellion toppled her. No invasion weakened her hold. Her empire remained intact until the moment she relinquished it. That kind of rule cannot be easily forgotten, no matter how many court historians try. And so, despite the silence of the stele, her story filtered into the cracks of literature and legend. Centuries later, writers reimagined her in operas and novels, sometimes as a villainous temptress, sometimes as a wise mother of the nation, times as a ghost wandering her own palace, asking for judgment no court would ever offer in 17th century drama. She was cast as both sage and schemer. In 20th century politics, she was invoked by feminist thinkers, by revolutionaries, by those who sought to reclaim stories long buried, even in modern Luoyang. Her image hangs in hotels and museums, stylized, softened, reinterpreted, but the truth remains elusive. Who was Wu Zixin? A woman who ruled because no man around her was fit to, or because she believed she was better than them. Was she cruel or merely decisive? Did she erase rivals or protect her reign? Did she seek power, or did power seek her? We have no direct letters, no confessions, no memoir. All that survives are the records others wrote, many of whom hated her, and so her real voice remains just out of reach. And yet, there is something profound in that blank stele, does not offer a final word, but an opening, a recognition that some lives cannot be easily summarized, that some rulers, especially those who defied the expectations of their time, will always live in ambiguity. Wu Zetian ruled for over 40 years. More than most emperors of China, she governed as consort, regent, and sovereign. She navigated ritual, religion, court intrigue, and bureaucratic warfare with precision. And she did so while maintaining the appearance of modesty, just enough to disarm, never enough to disappear. In the end, she was never truly dethroned. She left on her own terms. She died quietly in her own bedchamber, having outlived almost everyone who had opposed her. Her body lies beneath stone. Her memory drifts, sometimes praised, sometimes vilified, never entirely settled. And perhaps that is her truest legacy, not an empire of conquest or temples, but a question, a silence, so loud it still echoes. What if the greatest threat to a rigid world is not rebellion, but a woman who learns its rules, plays them better than anyone else, and then disappears without a word? Asterisk, the North Atlantic was never kind to travelers. Its waves were sharp-edged, winds unmerciful, and coasts jagged like shattered stone. But the Vikings crossed it anyway, for land, for trade, for exile. And in one of those longboats, its hull soaked and creaking, sat a woman named Aud, or, as later sagas would call her, the deep-minded. She was not born into obscurity. Her father, Ketil Flatnose, was a Norse chieftain of significance, standing in the Hebrides, a chain of islands scattered like bones off the western coast of Scotland. His family held land, led raids, married well. She herself married Olaf the White, a Norse Gael warrior king who ruled parts of Dublin in the mid-800s. It was a world stitched together by ocean winds and violent seasons. But even among warriors, Aud was different. When her husband Olaf died, in battle, likely in Ireland, she did not weep in the shadows. She did not remarry or retreat. Instead, she watched and waited. Her son, Thorstein the Red, inherited his father's ambitions. He carved out territory in northern Scotland through a series of campaigns. For a time, it seemed a dynasty would continue, rooted in the wild green hills of Alpa. But Thorstein, too, was cut down, betrayed by his own men. He died young, leaving Aud with no surviving male protector. Most women in her position would have been absorbed into another household, married off, pushed aside. Aud chose a different course. She commissioned a ship, not just any boat, but an air, a deep-bellied ocean-going vessel, suited for long voyages. And she had it built in secret, somewhere in Caithness, Scotland. The sagas say she kept the construction hidden from local rulers, an act of quiet rebellion against the men who had killed her son. When the ship was ready, she filled it, not with warriors, but with people, freed slaves, loyal retainers, family members, distant kin. 30 of them, the stories say. 30 souls bound together not by conquest, but by departure. Aud was leaving. Where to? Not east to Norway, where kings ruled and women's power was narrowed by custom. Not back to Ireland, where blood still stained the name of Olaf. She turned west, to Iceland, the edge of the known world. Iceland in the late 9th century was still forming, not just geologically, but socially. It had no central king, no cathedrals, no cities, just valleys, lava fields, and fjords. A blank slate. It's for those with the courage and cunning to shape it. And Aud arrived with intent. Unlike most settlers who arrived under the authority of men, Aud claimed land in her own name. She sailed around the western and southern coasts of Iceland, choosing territory with care. She eventually settled in the Breiðafjörður region on the Snæfellsnes Peninsula, harsh, isolated, but defensible. There, She built a homestead Vamrand, named herself Land Miskana, settler in her own right. The sagas say she divided land among her followers with fairness, ensuring that those who had escaped with her could survive with dignity. She freed many of the people who had served her, gave them farms, and arranged marriages that would tie her extended kin into the fabric of early Icelandic society. And she ruled, not with armies or swords, but with reputation, with memory, with presence. Even in Iceland's early oral traditions, dominated as they were by tales of male heroism, stands apart. She is described not as fierce, but as wise, not as wealthy, but as deliberate. She appears again and again as a figure of calm authority, a rare feat in the volatile poetry of the sagas. She hosted grand feasts. She arbitrated disputes. She founded churches unusual for a Norse matriarch in the 9th century when Christianity had not yet taken hold. Some believe she had converted herself, quietly, before ever reaching Iceland. When she grew old, she called for one final feast. All her family, all her followers, gathered. Odd died seated in dignity. Odd died seated in dignity. Her affairs settled, her legacy secured. She was buried not in the manner of a forgotten widow, but in a ship burial rite usually reserved for chieftains and honored warriors. Her body was placed inside a boat, earth heaped over it, grave goods nestled at her side. She had come to Iceland by ship, and she returned to the earth in one. It is easy to romanticize her, to imagine the fierce matriarch carving out a kingdom, in silence, resisting every expectation. But Odd's real legacy is quieter. She didn't conquer. She settled. She didn't rule with blood. She ruled with balance. She didn't claim Iceland with a sword, but she made sure no one else could take it from her. And yet, she remains on the margins of most Viking histories. Why? Because she didn't fit. Not in the mold of the shield maiden, nor in the mold of the obedient wife. She belonged to no man after her husband's death. She ruled no army. She held no throne. She simply governed intelligently, fairly, quietly. And perhaps that is why her name survives, not through runestones, but through sagas, through spoken memory, through the breath of one woman telling another. Across firelight, we came here with Odd. We survived because of her. So now, as you rest, imagine the sea, the long ship in the fog, a woman at its bow, hair silvered by wind, eyes fixed westward, and ask yourself how many kingdoms have been built not by conquest, but by the quiet resolve of someone who refused to be erased. Iceland in the 9th century was a land without kings. There were no thrones, no standing armies, no walled cities, just fjords that reached like quiet fingers into the sea, and valleys too wide for voices to carry. Power in such a place came not from gold or conquest, but from naming. And Odd named everything. The sagas say that after arriving on the western coast, she sailed slowly along the southern shores of Iceland, surveying the land as she went. She stopped at inlets, gauged the wind, tasted the soil. Each time she settled somewhere, she gave the place a name, her name, or the names of those she brought with her. This act was not merely symbolic. In Viking culture, to name a place was to claim it. The act of speaking a landscape into language gave it identity, lineage, and legal recognition. Zalani Mabak, Iceland's Book of Settlements, records how these early pioneers marked the territory. Odd, though a woman, is listed among them not as wife or daughter, but as a settler, in her own right. She claimed the Breiðafjörður region-wide, difficult terrain, marked by sea cliffs and basalt ridges. She chose a site called Hvamr for her homestead. From there, she distributed land to her followers, freedmen and kin alike. Many of them had been enslaved or displaced before her journey, and Odd, uniquely among her peers, freed them. This alone sets her apart. In a time when slavery was embedded into Norse economic life, where captives were a form of currency. Aud released hers and made them settlers. She arranged marriages for some. She gave others land. Their names appear in the saga Zerper, Dufgil, Skidgenot as footnotes, but as founding figures of Icelandic farms and family lines. This was not charity. It was architecture. She was building a society, and she understood that Iceland, harsh and spare, would not survive long under the rules of kings or the customs of conquest. What was needed was kinship, shared ownership, resilience. At her farm, she hosted feasts not for celebration, but for structure. In Norse culture, feasting was not just a social event. It was political. The host demonstrated wealth by feeding. Others, guests, demonstrated loyalty by attending. Debts were settled. Alliances formed. Laws remembered. Aud's feasts were known for their order. Everyone had a place. Elders were respected. Stories were told not of raiding or royal blood, but of hardship, loyalty, and survival. This is how she ruled, with seating arrangements and farmland parcels, with name-giving and memory. She did not need guards or coins to have the trust those who survived with her. And there's something remarkable in this. She never remarried. For a widow of wealth and influence, marriage would have been a simple way to secure power. But Aud remained alone, ruling from her homestead, never subordinate to another man. In Viking law, widows had some independence, but Aud stretched this to its limit and beyond. She created a legacy, not through sons, but through land and people. Her descendants went on to become major figures in Icelandic society. The Landamabok traces the lineages of many early chieftains, many of whom trace their origins to Aud's household. But by then, she had long been gone. She died not in conflict, but at peace. The sagas say she organized one final feast to mark her own death. Her family gathered. Her freedmen came. And during the gathering, perhaps, in the middle of a toast, perhaps in the quiet after the stories were done, she passed. They buried her in a ship grave on high ground, not far from her home. The boat was pulled ashore, filled with her possessions, tools, cloth, perhaps even a few coins. Earth was mounded over it, stones arranged. No runestone was raised, no saga written then, but the story survived. And in that survival, she became a paradox, a woman without a title, who ruled without resistance, a settler who founded a society, not on war, but on quiet fairness, a landowner who gave land to the landless, a pagan woman who may have followed Christian rites in secret, because that part, too, lingers in uncertainty. Aud lived at the cusp of religious transformation. Christianity was not yet dominant in Scandinavia, but fragments of belief were, drifting westward, carried by Irish monks, trade, and exile. Some sagas suggest she had Christian beliefs, that her ship burial included a cross, that she founded one of the first churches in Iceland. If so, she practiced quietly. Iceland remained pagan for another century. And yet Aud's sense of belief, like her sense of leadership, was rooted in personal decision, not public conformity. She chose what suited her world and ignored what didn't, and that may be why she was remembered. She was not the only woman in Viking history with power, but she was one of the few remembered for how she used it rather than how she lost it. She didn't die in a raid. She didn't fade into the background. She didn't wait for someone else to grant her authority. She simply stepped into the role no one else could fill, and quietly made a kingdom out of raw stone and colder seas. So now, as the winds of memory soften and the voices of her freedmen still echo in the fjords, one thought remains: how many leaders have ruled better for not wanting to rule at all? Asterisk. When the sagas speak of kings, they speak of battles, of men with swords, of land taken, of oaths made under threat. But when they speak of awed, the deep-minded, the tone shifts. There is less thunder, less dust. Story feels like mist over a quiet fjord, soft, steady, and somehow still there after everything else has changed. After her burial, the mound she was laid in stood high above each family. For a time, people visited. They knew where she had lived and how she had ruled not by decree or domination, but through calm order. But eventually, the winds of time shifted. The sagas themselves, though written down long after she died, gave her only a few pages. And even then, there's a feeling in the text that she was an exception, an anomaly, a woman with the influence of a king, but not the name of one. It's a settler who should have been a placeholder until the real figures, chieftains, priests, or warriors took over, but they never did. Odd had simply done the work so thoroughly that no one else needed to. And maybe that's the part history struggles to record. Not the conflict, not the collapse, but the quiet, competent holding of a world together. Her land divisions lasted. Her freedmen became farmers. Her descendants shaped the early laws and gatherings of Iceland, particularly the Althing, one of the oldest parliamentary assemblies in the world. They gathered in Lingvalar every summer, descendants of chieftains, poets, outlaws, and former slaves. Among them, a few could still trace their line back to Odd, not through blood, always, but through land, through the names she gave valleys, the steadings she marked, the soil she freedmen walked on. Centuries passed. Iceland changed rulers, Norwegians, then Danes. The Christian church replaced the old gods. Sagas were written down, some distorted, some lost. Odd's story was preserved, mostly in Land of Mobach and the Laxdela saga, texts compiled by men who wrote about her with a kind of respectful surprise, as if unsure what to do with a woman who fit none of the categories they knew. She was not a saint, not a seductress, not a queen consort or martyr. She was simply ... competent, free, and unafraid. Perhaps that's what made her dangerous, and forgettable, all at once. Historians later debated her religion. Some claimed she was Christian because the saga described her raising crosses and conducting burial rituals unlike the old ways. Others argued that the Christian details were added later to make her more palatable to medieval scribes. But even this uncertainty reinforces her independence. She chose her rites, her rituals, her way of dying. That act, too, was part of her. Rule to hold a feast in honor of your own death, to gather the people you've led, to make your final night a celebration rather than a fading is not just brave. It is structured, planned, a farewell that felt more like a blueprint than an elegy. And what remains now? The mound may have faded. The buildings of her homestead long since returned to the earth, but the steadings she founded still bear names tied to her. And across Iceland, the memory of her style of governance measured fair, built on kin and cooperation rather than conquest, still hums beneath the surface of local memory in many ways. Her legacy is Iceland itself, a place where land was once divided, not by generals, but by widows, where power could come from clarity, not blood, and where the loudest impact came not from the swing of an axe, but the slow, deliberate choice to free others and give them names. And so, we are left with an image not of a woman on horseback, or in a throne room, but standing quietly on a ridge of black earth, watching the wind comb across the fjord, deciding who would live where and how. Her shadow, even now, is not one that looms. It simply ... holds, and one wonders, in the absence of kings and armies, how many societies might have been stronger had they been built, not by those who sought to rule, but by those who understood what people needed simply to survive. Asterisk in the deep chambers of China's Tang Dynasty court, behind doors carved with dragons and phoenixes. Names were written with brushes dipped in black ink. Names of generals, officials, poets, criminals. But there was one name that, for a time, was written in red color reserved for emperors. That name was Wu Cetin. She began as a concubine, not an unusual start, and not one that promised much. Her name at birth was Wu Zhao, born in 624 CE to a family of modest but comfortable standing. Her father, Wu Shai Wu, was a timber merchant who later gained favor with the Tang court. This allowed young Wu to be educated, a rare gift for girls. In 7th century China, she learned to read and write, studied the classics, and absorbed Buddhist teachings that would later become the philosophical armor of her rule. At 14, she entered the imperial palace as a concubine of Emperor Taizong. But he was not the man whose shadow she would live in. That distinction belonged to his son, Li Si later, Emperor Gaozong, when Taizong died. Most of his concubines, including Wu, were expected to enter a Buddhist nunnery. That was the custom. The customs only bind those who do not rewrite them. Wu Zhao left the nunnery, somehow through alliances, whispered arrangements, or simple audacity. She re-entered the palace as a concubine to the new emperor, Gaozong. This return was scandalous. It flouted tradition. But it was only the first in a long chain of actions that would unravel centuries of male-dominated rule. In the early years, Wu played a careful game. She did not demand power, she absorbed it. When the empress fell out of favor, Wu rose. When ministers doubted her, she buried them in paper, proclamations, appointments, perfectly composed edicts. That made dissenters look disorganized and unprincipled. When Emperor Gaozong suffered a debilitating illness, it was Wu who stepped in to manage affairs of state. Not publicly, not with crowns or speeches, but through scrolls and seals and red-ink corrections. She managed from behind the curtain. That curtain Chan became the symbol of her reign. The term Chuangling Tenjian described how she listened to politics behind the curtain. She did not sit on the throne at first, but ruled from the shadow of it, signing papers, issuing orders, guiding policy in ink and silence. Behind every minister who spoke in court, behind every tax reform or diplomatic mission, there was the trace of her writing, measured, direct, and precise. She developed a bureaucratic structure so effective that even her enemies used it after her death. And as her power grew, so did the tensions. The court was uneasy with a woman handling the imperial seal. Confucian principles disapproved. Sisters whispered. Scholars wrote essays on the dangers of female rule. And so, Wu answered in the only language power respects. She centralized the examination system, promoted officials based on talent rather than lineage, expanded the civil service, and quietly began removing anyone who challenged her authority. Some disappeared. Some were exiled. Some simply found themselves sidelined. Their roles reduced to ceremonial pageantry, while real governance flowed through her, canes, and secretaries. The official histories would later depict her as cruel, as manipulative, as a schemer. But what they rarely noted was how often her rule worked. Flood relief improved. Grain distribution stabilized. Buddhism flourished under state patronage. The machinery of state tangent, creaking, mail ran smoother when oiled by her methods. Still, her name was dangerous. Even as her power became unendurable, the court struggled with how to describe her. Was she an empress, a regent, a consort? She offered them a new title, emperor, and in 690 CE, she made it official. She founded her own dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, interrupting the Thames lineage and proclaiming herself the only female emperor in the history of China. Not empress dowager, not empress regent, emperor, absolute, singular. She moved into the imperial palace as its supreme occupant, and began changing the language of rule itself. Words associated with male sovereignty were rewritten or replaced. New characters were created to reflect feminine strength and divinity. She promoted scholars who supported her legitimacy and punished those who did not. And through it all, her power continued to flow through the documents she signed, the appointments she made, and the poems she approved. More than any military campaign or palace intrigue, it was her mastery of paper, of the quiet, slow, dull machinery of administration that allowed her to bend an empire. Yet, despite this mastery, even Wu could not escape the weight of narrative. After her death in 705, her Zhou dynasty was erased. The Tang dynasty resumed. Her statues were removed. Histories were revised. Officials claimed she had disrupted the natural order. Even her gravestone was left blank. No inscription, no summary of deeds, only silence, as if the act of remembering her properly might reopen a question they preferred closed. And yet, her name persisted, written in red ink, in secret letters, in scrolls that survived in dusty temples and forbidden libraries. Her reforms, too, persisted, hidden in the bureaucracy, embedded in civil service structures, buried under layers of court language and etiquette. And so we are left to wonder, was it her gender that made her dangerous? Or was it the fact that she governed so well they feared others might try the same? And if power, wielded quietly through paper and ink, can shape the course of a continent, then what else might we have missed in the margins of history? Asterisk, by the time Wu Cixin formally declared herself emperor in 690 CE, she had already ruled China in practice for nearly 2 decades. But the moment she took the throne, officially sitting on the dragon throne in her own right, with no husband or son as intermediary, she became something unprecedented. Not just a ruler, but a disruption. She chose Luoyang, not Chang'an, as the capital of a new dynasty, the Zhou dynasty. It was symbolic. Chang'an had been the seat of Tang legitimacy. Luoyang, though older and less politically significant at the time, offered a fresh start, a city of scholars and monks, rather than aristocrats and generals, a city she could shape. She moved the machinery of government, there like a person reassembling a loomish official, a spindle, each law a thread. And she began weaving something new, an empire defined not by military conquest or lineage, but by bureaucracy. It's cold, dull, reliable bureaucracy. At first glance, her reign seems unremarkable to modern ears. She held examinations, she evaluated memorials, she issued reforms, but the power of her decisions lay not in their drama, but in their durability. She understood that if she could reshape the paperwork of the empire, the flow of permissions, the design of titles, the wording of law, she could outlast even death. She promoted men of lower birth, men not tied to the great families who opposed her claim. Many of these new officials came from modest backgrounds and owed their rise entirely to her. It was a clever gamble. They were capable, hungry, and loyal not to the dynasty, but to her person. She expanded the imperial examination system dramatically. Previously, appointments had been heavily tilted toward aristocratic recommendation. Wu wanted merit, or at least the appearance of it. A scholar who passed the civil service exam now had a path to power that bypassed bloodline entirely. She was reforming not just the government, but how legitimacy was defined. No longer was it enough to be born into a noble house. You had to write, interpret, and obey state documents, a skill more enduring than swordsmanship. Under her rule, literacy became a path to governance. And through that path, she cultivated allies among the literati and Buddhist clergy. She commissioned the writing of new Buddhist scriptures that described her as a reincarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. These texts framed her rule not as a disruption, but as divine restoration. Confucian scholars, however, were not so convinced. The Confucian worldview was deeply patriarchal, and the idea of a woman ruling, especially as emperor, was incompatible with their philosophy. They called her names in coded essays, compared her to fox spirits and seductresses. Some plotted to assassinate her. She responded not with mass purges, but with precise removals. Accusations were investigated, trials held, rebellions quietly snuffed out. Some executions did occur, but not in public spectacle. Her punishments were administrative dismissals, demotions, internal exile. She erased dissent like a scribe striking through a faulty line. Zishan even created her own set of Chinese characters, new logograms, to express ideas that hadn't existed in the official language. Words for feminine strength, moral clarity, divine leadership. One of the characters she introduced, combining elements for heaven, earth, and human, conveyed the notion of unified sovereignty. That symbol became her personal title. It was never widely adopted, but that wasn't the point. The point was that she was retooling the language of rule, line by line. She commissioned massive historical works, proved edits to the official dynastic histories, encouraged the preservation of biographies that favored her rule. But even with these efforts, she couldn't fully control the narrative. Later, Confucian historians, writing under male emperors of the restored Tang dynasty, would reverse many of these records. They portrayed her as a tyrant, a usurper, a woman who used sex and fear to climb to power. They rarely mentioned the canals repaired, the grain reserves increased, or the population stabilized under her rule. They didn't mention the orphanages she sponsored, or the public hospitals built in Luoyang. These were not dramatic events. They did not fit the narrative of villainy, but they mattered. She created an empire that could run without her physical presence, an empire of parchment and regulation. Her court functioned with quiet efficiency. Ministers sent memorials. Secretaries reviewed them. Petitions were sorted, judged, and returned with annotations in red. Sometimes those annotations were hers. Her use of red ink was not symbolic, it was literal. The emperor's responses were written in red. It was the color of final decision, of imperial approval or denial. Zishan was not just reading policy, she was editing it, and unlike many rulers who governed through force or charisma, who ruled through process, she understood that the slow, tedious operation of the state, the part most emperors delegated or ignored, was the key to permanence. It was not glorious, Yet, even this carefully structured reign began to show strain as she aged. She had ruled effectively for decades, but old allies died. Younger ministers rose with ambitions of their own. Her sons began to plot. Her health began to fail. And through it all, the empire held but barely. She had built a government that could sustain order, but not affection. The bureaucracy she empowered resented her even as it obeyed her. And outside the palace walls, whispers grew louder. The final years of her reign were filled with internal strife. Factions aligned with her favorites, the Zhang brothers, competed with conservative courtiers. Tension tightened like string drawn across a bow. In 705, a palace coup finally forced her to abdicate. Her son, Zhongzong, was restored to the throne. She died shortly thereafter, and once again, the record shifted. Historians of the restored Tang dynasty made quick work of her legacy. They buried her achievements under stories of corruption and cruelty. The characters she invented were deleted from the official dictionaries. Her new dynasty was labeled a disruption. Her reforms, though often retained, were no longer attributed to her. And most telling of all, they left her tombstone blank. No praise, no condemnation. Just a massive stone slab standing silent in the earth. It was a final insult, or perhaps a final challenge, because in that silence there remains a question that can't be dismissed. If Zishan had been born a man, would she be remembered as one of China's greatest emperors, Or was her erasure the cost of her precision, her decision to rule not with spectacle or war, but with the quiet stroke of a red brush? Asterisk, the tomb of Wu Zishan lies west of Luoyang, at the base of Mount Liangshan, in what is now Shanxi province. It's part of the Qinling Mausoleum complex, which she shares with her husband, Emperor Gaozong of Temsa. Their joint tomb, sealed within the mountain itself, has never been officially opened. It was not looting or erosion that preserved it like many imperial tombs. It was hesitation. Even centuries later, no ruler dared violate the resting place of China's only woman emperor. Not out of reverence, necessarily, but out of uncertainty. Inside that mountain may lie tablets, documents, or artifacts that clarify her rule, or contradict it, or unravel it. The Tang dynasty that followed her made great efforts to control the story, to erase her presence even as they benefited from her reforms. But the physical record sealed in stone could still append the carefully rewritten past. On the front of her tomb stands a massive stelia, blank stele, K, a smooth face of polished stone with no inscription. All other emperors had grand epitaphs, carved in their honor, words like illustrious, divine, enlightened, or benevolent, paragraphs praising military conquests, economic strength, or philosophical insight. But for Wu Zishan, there are none. It was her decision. She ordered that the stone remain uncarved. Historians have speculated endlessly about her reasons. Was it humility, invitation to future generations to judge her deeds for themselves? Final act of defiance. Oh, perhaps something more unsettling. The quiet awareness that no record she wrote, no narrative she shaped, would survive untouched by the hands of men. Because Wu Zishan understood the deep irony of history, that it is not made by those who live it, was written later by those who survived it, and in her case, by those who resented it. After her abdication, the Tang court moved swiftly to reassert the patriarchal order. Her dynasty, the Zhouas, struck from the official lists, declared illegitimate. Her title of emperor was downgraded in posthumous records to Empress Dowager. Her name appeared only sparingly in official documents, but the bureaucracy she built, it remained. Her reforms to the examination system became permanent. Her insistence on merit over nobility slowly reshaped the empire's social structure. Officials she had raised from obscurity trained the next generation of ministers, in the expectation that an emperor should read, write, and govern through paper, not just command armies, endured. In short, Wu Zishan lost the story, but won the system. It is here that her legacy becomes difficult to frame in traditional terms. She did not rule by love, nor by blood, nor by victory in war. She ruled by insertion, placing herself into documents, positions, in rituals that had no space for her. And when she was removed, the void remained. Future empresses and consorts would never again hold the same power she wielded. The precedent had been set, but never repeated, not because she failed, but because she succeeded too well. Her existence showed what was possible, so it had to be made unrepeatable. When modern scholars attempt to reconstruct Wu Zishan's reign, they face a wall of contradictions. Buddhist texts describe her as a holy savior. Confucian annals frame her as a moral disaster. Poetry alternates between awe and revulsion. No single image holds. No clean summary fits. And yet, if you walk the halls of Luoyang's ancient government buildings, or read the surviving memorials of her court, you find the traces of something enduring. A hand that moved quietly across parchment, a policy that bypassed centuries of nobility, a bureaucracy that survived dynasty, war, and time. The truth is that Wu Zishan governed through dullness, through record-keeping, through revisions and rubrics, and quietly rotated officials. And in doing so, she reshaped the empire from the inside out. The Tang dynasty rose again after her death, but it could not return to what it had been before her. It was no longer a playground for aristocrats. It had become a machine illiterate, centralized, policy-driven machine, and that machine bore her fingerprints. The tragedy of Wu Zishan is not that she failed, it is that her success was intentionally forgotten. She had broken the system, only to rebuild it stronger. But history could not allow her to claim it, and so we return to the tomb. The mountain, a blank stele. Some visitors today see it as a monument to erasure final silencing of a woman who dared to rule. Others see it as a provocation, a challenge to the future, to uncover what was hidden, to tell what was untold. And then there are those who see in that stone the truest record of her reign, not in what it says, but in what it refuses to say. A record not written in words, but in absence, a legacy not honored with titles, but embedded in systems, and a question still unanswered. If you ruled the world, believe behind no sentence, no statue, no praise-only silence, and structured it did truly vanish. Or did you simply outlast the ink? Imagine, for a moment, the narrow alleyways of early 16th century Tutuanan, the northern coast of Morocco. You can hear the creak of ships rocking in the port, the shouts of fishermen, the murmur of court scribes copying letters in shaded courtyards. The air smells of salt, citrus, and ink. And behind high, whitewashed walls, past arched doors and tiled fountains, sits a woman most have forgotten. She was a queen, a governor, a widow, a negotiator, a pirate. Her name was Saida L-Hurra. Means the noble lady who is free. That wasn't a title. It was a declaration. And yet, when most histories of the Mediterranean are written of pirates, of colonialism, of corsairs and crusades, her name is missing. Even today, in the Arab world, where her reign left a mark across 2 continents, Saida Hurra is mostly a shadow. She appears briefly in footnotes and biographies of men, occasionally in lists of female rulers, but rarely, if ever, in depth. Perhaps because her power was unorthodox, or because it was maritime, or because it did not last, or because the paper trail she left was thin letters without replies, treaties without signatures, ports written by enemies, but she ruled nonetheless. She was born around 1485 in the city of Granada, the daughter of a noble Andalusian family. She was just a child when the city fell to the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. In 1492, her family, like thousands of other Muslims and Jews, was forced to flee across the Mediterranean. They settled in Morocco, in exile, their lands and titles lost, but they did not forget. Saida was educated in the port town of Chefchaouen, stronghold of Andalusian refugees. There she studied law, theology, and the Quran. She also learned languages, Arabic, Spanish, and Portuguese. But perhaps most importantly, she grew up surrounded by people who had lost everything: their homes, status, their past. For Saida, that wound would become her compass. By the time she reached adulthood, she was married off to a powerful local leader, Mulay Ali ibn Rashid, governor of Tetouan. This was not an uncommon arrangement marriage, as political alliance, but in this case, the alliance took on a curious tone. Saida did not fade into domesticity. She joined her husband in governing. She handled correspondence. She gave orders. Her voice appeared in edicts and rulings. And when her husband died suddenly around 1515, she did not step aside. She took command as the new governor of Tetouan. She held a rare position for a woman in the Islamic world at the time, not as a symbolic figurehead or dowager, but as a ruling authority. There was no veil over her authority, no intermediary through whom power flowed. She was the state, but she was not content with inland politics. Sayyid A. Turned to the sea at the time. The Mediterranean was a boiling, broken map of piracy, trade, and war. The Spanish and Portuguese had built forts along the African coast. Christian crusaders patrolled the waters. Italian merchants crisscrossed in galleys, and on the North African side, a new generation of corsairs, often sanctioned by Muslim states, began attacking Christian vessels in retaliation. Asterisk. This was not piracy as modern minds imagine it. It was policy. Privateering, as it was called, became a form of asymmetric warfare. Muslim corsairs struck Spanish and Portuguese ships, stole cargo, kidnapped passengers, and used the profits to rebuild what had been lost in Andalusia. Saida O'Hora became one of its most powerful orchestrators. Though she rarely led attacks personally, she built the networks. She financed ships, formed alliances with famous pirate captains like Barbarossa of Algiers, and coordinated raids from Tetuan's harbors. Her fleet harassed the Spanish coastline for years. Her name appeared in intercepted letters and panicked royal reports, and she did something else too. She negotiated, CYIDA, corresponded with both Christian and Muslim leaders. She offered safe passage in exchange for money. She arranged prisoner exchanges. She enforced embargoes. She played the same diplomatic game as the crowned heads of Europe, but on her own terms, from a city ruled not by legacy or inheritance, but by necessity. Still, even at the height of her power, she walked a narrow line. Her rule rested on legitimacy. She had to constantly reinforce. She was not part of a royal bloodline. She was not appointed by a sultan. Her authority came from her position as a widow, a regent, a pirate queen. It was precarious, unusual, and dangerous, and it could not last. Forever, in 1541, Saida O'Hora made a bold move. She remarried this time to the Sultan of Morocco himself, Ahmed al-Watazi. It was the first time in Moroccan history that a king had left his palace to marry someone elsewhere. He came to her, but something changed after that. Her marriage, meant to solidify her authority, made her appear vulnerable to critics. She was no longer the untouchable widow governor of Tetuan, but a woman with courtly entanglements. Her autonomy was questioned. A network of corsairs began to splinter. Rumors of mismanagement spread. The political winds turned. Within a few years, she was overthrown. There was no dramatic war, no siege or rebellion. One morning, her stepson took power in Tetuan. The records are sparse. There are no death sentences, no trials, no public executions. She simply vanished from official documents and history. Always eager to forget complicated women, followed suit. Yet, the traces remained in merchant accounts of ransom payments, and letters from Christian captives pleading for mercy. In the diplomatic silence that followed her downfall. And in the harbor towns of Morocco, where oral histories still whisper her name not as villain or hero, but as something harder to categorize. Saida O'Hora ruled from the margins. She navigated not only seas, but the unstable waters of exile, gender, and memory. And she did it with remarkable precision. But we are left with a question. How does a woman so powerful, so central to the politics of an entire coastline, simply disappear from the archive? And what might that say about the way history chooses who to remember? Asterisk. The Mediterranean was always more than water. It was memory, revenge, exile, commerce, power, and Saida O'Hora understood all of it not from books or maps, but from the shoreline itself. After the fall of Granada in 1492, an entire generation of displaced Muslims poured into the North African coast. They brought with them stories of loss, poems of paradise lost, and a gnawing ache for vengeance. Some became teachers, scholars, or clerics, but others, those who knew how to sail, became something else entirely, CORSARS, and in Tetuan, under the careful guidance of Saida O'Hora. They didn't just plunder ships, became a state apparatus. To understand her power, one must look beyond her marriage and her city. She wasn't just a provincial governor, she was the linchpin of a maritime network that stretched from the shores of Morocco to the harbors of Algiers, Tripoli, Tunis, and even the Ottoman HEA-RTLA, NDS. At the heart of this alliance was Khair ad-Din Barbarossa, the legendary Ottoman admiral and corsair who terrorized the Spanish coast. Though their relationship is rarely explored in detail, Saida and Barbarossa appear to have worked in tandem, a rare, powerful partnership between two of the most feared naval figures in the Islamic world. Sayyida provided the ships. Barbarossa offered firepower and political cover. It's unclear whether they met face to face often, but the coordinated attacks caused chaos in the Iberian Peninsula. Spanish records from the time mention La Mujer de Tituán in tones of both fear and confusion. Who was this woman? Why could no one stop her? And why did Christian captains keep disappearing near the Strait of Gibraltar? There were reports, sketchy and inconsistent, of ransom deals negotiated by a veiled woman, messages delivered in perfect Castilian Spanish, demanding gold for noble prisoners, of threats written in calligraphy on Moroccan paper, sealed with unknown symbols. Some accused her of witchcraft, others of madness, but none could deny she was in control, and this control extended into her governance. Saida ran Tituán as a hybrid city, part refugee settlement, part naval base, part marketplace. She welcomed Andalusian, exiles, Jewish, Muslim, and even some Christian. They could offer skills in trade, shipbuilding, or defense. She built schools, courts, and mosques. Under her leadership, Tituán became a cosmopolitan, chaotic, and profitable haven. She also kept a tight grip on justice. Records suggest she imposed harsh penalties on corruption, demanded fair taxation, and maintained control over the legal systems, sometimes bypassing religious judges altogether. As a woman, she could not lead prayers, but she could sign decrees, jail extortionists, and command fleets. It was a delicate arrangement. Some supported her out of respect, others out of fear, many, likely, out of necessity. She represented stability in a time of chaos, a protector in a region without reliable armies, and for exiled Andalusians. She was more than a ruler. She was the last living echo of what had been taken from them. Still, outside Tituán, the perception was murkier. Christian powers viewed her as an enemy, but many Muslim rulers found her troubling as well. She didn't fit easily into their world of dynasties and protocols. Her authority stemmed not from blood, but from resilience, not from conquest, but from administration, not from royal command, but from community trust. And that made her unpredictable. In 1541, when she married Sultan Ahmed al-Watasi, the political landscape shifted. The union was designed to cement her power, bringing the pirate queen into the heart of Moroccan politics. But the plan backfired. The Sultan was weak, barely clinging to power in a fractured kingdom. His enemies multiplied, and many saw the marriage as a liability. Saida's independence, once her greatest strength, became an inconvenience to those looking to centralize authority. Her enemies began to whisper. They accused her of embezzlement, of failing to protect trade routes, of mismanaging military funds. Some even claimed she had consorted too closely with the Ottomans, threatening Morocco's autonomy. There were no trials, no public hearings, just rumors. And then, one morning, as the sun rose over Tituán's walls, her stepson declared her reign over. She was not executed, not imprisoned, just replaced. A strange end for a woman who had once held the strait between two continents in her hands. What happened to her after that remains unclear. Some believe she retired to Chefchaouen, the city where she had been raised. Others suggest she withdrew to private life, living out her final years in relative peace. but the records go silent. She does not appear in Ottoman chronicles, nor in Moroccan ones. Spanish records mention her name only in passing, mostly in the past tense, as if she were already a relic. And perhaps that's how history wanted it. After all, she did not fit the mold of power. She was not a queen in a palace or a consort with the cause. She was something older, stranger, a female ruler of a coastal city who brokered power through exile, memory, and the sea. Her story did not end in tragedy. It ended in quiet. And sometimes, that's even harder to trace. But one must ask, Seth El-Hora had been a man. Would her name sit beside Barbarossa, Suleiman, or Charles V in textbooks today? And if not, then how many other women like her have vanished into the waterlogged pages of forgotten empires? Asterisk, some women vanish in the shadows of palaces, others in the smoke of battles. But Sayda Al-Hora faded beneath the waves of silence. No headlines, no grave, no anthem sung in her name. Her reign had once straddled two worlds, the sacred and the profane, the land and the sea. And now, like the tide she once commanded, she was gone. No final letter, no farewell speech, no dramatic fall, only stillness in a world that documented the births and deaths of male rulers in obsessive detail. Sayyida's departure from public life is oddly undocumented. The very skills that made her powerful, ambiguity, flexibility, decisiveness, now worked against her memory. She had not carved her name into marble. She had not built colossal monuments. Her legacy lived in stories, oral accounts, merchant whispers, naval logs scribbled in haste, taste, and those, over time, were lost. Asterisk. The records of Tituane shifted focus after her departure. New leaders came. The city's ports changed hands. And eventually, the once feared Corsair capital became just another dot on the Moroccan coast, too small to matter to Europe, too independent to be trusted by inland dynasties. And yet, for decades afterward, crusty sailors still muttered her name, La Senora del Mar, the Lady of the Sea. Even in absence, her myth lingered. But myths, too, are subject to gravity. Without documentation, Sayyida's memory drifted. Some later historians argued she had been merely a figurehead, used by male advisors. Others claimed her naval campaigns were exaggerated. A few even suggested she never existed at all, that she was a fusion of local legends and Ottoman propaganda. The erasure was slow, subtle, bureaucratic. Her name disappeared from official histories of Morocco. She was left out of court chronicles, skipped in diplomatic memoirs, ignored in European letters that otherwise chronicled every pirate and pretender along the Barbary coast. This was not censorship. It was convenience. She had not left a son to inherit her title. She had not built a dynasty that required legitimizing. And so, the record keepers, overwhelmingly male, urban, and religious, had little reason to preserve the memory of a woman who would have ruled a coastal frontier on her own terms. But there were traces, always, there were traces in Tituan oral traditions, lingered. Stories passed through families about the veiled woman who spoke Andalusi Spanish, who refused to bow before kings, who brought prosperity and justice to a refugee city. Her name became a cautionary tale for some, a symbol of freedom for others, and in rare manuscripts, mostly preserved in dusty libraries across the Maghreb and Iberia, small notes appear, mentions of her ships, her treaties, her influence, but nothing conclusive. Centuries later, in the 20th century, scholars revisiting the history of the Western Mediterranean began to stumble upon fragments. An unusually powerful female figure in Tituan, a marriage to the Sultan, connections to Ottoman, naval campaigns, ports from Christian prisoners. And slowly, painstakingly, Sayda Al-Hora began to emerge again as a myth, but as a historical actor. Still, there was no consensus. Historians debated everything from her birth year to the nature of her authority. Was she a governor, a queen, a pirate, a diplomat? Was she a loyal subject of the Moroccan Sultanate, or a rogue agent of the Ottoman sea lords? Even her name presented puzzles. Saida is a title meaning lady or mistress. Al-Hora means the free one. Together, they are less a name than a statement. No birth name, no family name, it's just a title and a status. And perhaps that too was by design. Maybe she didn't want to be remembered as someone's daughter or someone's wife. Maybe her true identity was a ship, a coastline, a legal decree, something untraceable, something alive only in practice. And so her memory remains fragile. It cannot be contained by a statue or a textbook paragraph. It lives in the contradictions. A woman ruler in a patriarchal society, a Muslim ally of Christian exiles, a privateer who built a city of learning, a diplomat who made war her language. What she built did not last forever. But then again, few things in exile do. Yet her story still matters, because it reveals the scaffolding of a race not through violence or scandal, but through omission. She was a race not because she failed, but because she succeeded too far outside the script. She didn't conform to the categories historians prefer. She didn't leave easy archives. She didn't belong to a lineage that needed glorifying. And perhaps that is the fate of many powerful women in history, not to be vilified, but to be gently forgotten, brushed aside with the phrase, "There's not enough evidence." But you might ask if this is what happened to Saida Al-Hora, a queen who ruled fleets and struck fear into empires. Then, what about the others, the countless unnamed women who organized ports, governed cities, financed uprisings, taught diplomacy, healed rebels, translated maps, and disappeared without a trace? How many erased queens still sleep beneath our textbooks? And what does it say about history when survival, without spectacle, is not enough to be remembered?